It all started on one of those bitterly cold nights when the wind seemed to tear through every crack in the old house, sending shivers that no blanket could ever quite erase. I was in the kitchen, staring at the faint glow of a single candle. The power had been out for what felt like hours, and the quiet was so thick it seemed to press against the walls, like the darkness outside was pushing its way in. My mom sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since turned cold. She hadn't said much. She just kept watching the flame flicker, as if it held the answers she'd been searching for but couldn't find. The air was tinged with the faint scent of cinnamon, a reminder of the half-eaten cookies left on the table. It was a weak attempt to bring some warmth to a situation that felt far too cold. Our home was small and drafty, tucked away on the edge of town, where winters were always a little harsher, and time seemed to drag on slower. But that night, the silence felt heavier. It carried something unspoken, like it was full of words neither of us dared to let out. You know, she finally broke the quiet, her voice little more than a murmur. I've been thinking about the things I should have done differently. Her words hung in the air, thick like smoke. I didn't know how to answer. The way she said it, like it was a confession, unsettled me. I grabbed one of the cookies, more out of habit than hunger, needing something to do with my hands. "You've done enough," I said, trying to sound reassuring, even though I wasn't sure I believed it. She had done her best, raising me on her own after Dad left. That wasn't easy. And this old house? It was a testament to all the sacrifices she'd made. But looking at her now, her face weary and her eyes distant, I realized she didn't see it that way. Her gaze wandered to the window, where frost clung to the glass like delicate spider webs. "It doesn't feel like it," she murmured. I didn't know how to respond, so I stayed quiet, letting the silence fill the space between us. The wind outside grew louder, rattling the window as if it was trying to break through. I could faintly hear the hum of a car passing down the highway, a reminder that life continued beyond these walls, even if our lives seemed to be standing still. "I've been thinking," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, "about how much you've grown up, how much you've carried without complaining." Her words caught me off guard. I looked at her, but she wasn't meeting my eyes. There was something about the way she sat there, her shoulders hunched, that made her seem so small, so fragile. I didn't want to, I admitted, the honesty surprising me, but it felt like I had no choice. She nodded slowly, her lips pressing into a tight line, like my words confirmed something she already knew. The candle flickered between us, casting shadows that made her look older than she was. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking, "for everything." Her apology felt heavy, like it carried the weight of years of mistakes and regrets. I didn't know how to handle it. Part of me wanted to tell her it was okay, that I understood, but another part of me couldn't shake the sting of all the times I had to grow up too soon and carry burdens that weren't mine. "It's fine," I said, though the words felt hollow. I didn't want to make her feel worse. She looked at me, her eyes glassy, full of unshed tears, and for a moment, I thought she might say more, but she didn't. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand brushing mine as she leaned in a little closer. Before I had time to process what was happening, she kissed me softly on the forehead. It was a small gesture, but one that felt both comforting and unbearably sad. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "more than you'll ever know." And just like that, she stood up, picked up her mug, and walked out of the kitchen. Her footsteps faded down the hall, leaving me alone with the flickering candle and the lingering warmth of her words. I sat there for what felt like forever after she left, staring at the candle's flame as it wavered in the draft. Her kiss had caught me off guard, leaving me with a strange mix of comfort, guilt, and confusion. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been some sort of unspoken goodbye, though I had no idea to what. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the house as if it were trying to warn me of something I couldn't yet understand. The weeks after that night blurred together, one ordinary day bleeding into the next. The house still stood, stubborn against the winter's chill, and I kept myself busy with repairs I didn't know how to finish and chores that always seemed to multiply. The power flickered on and off more times than it should have, and each time it returned, The house felt emptier, as if the light only highlighted what was missing. Mom started working longer hours at the small craft store downtown. It wasn't a great job, but it kept her occupied, and for some reason, staying busy seemed to keep her going. She'd leave in the morning with her thermos of coffee and return late in the evening, her face flushed from the cold. She didn't talk about her day much, and I didn't press. There was something in her silence that made it clear she didn't want to share. But one evening, things were different. She came home earlier than usual, her cheeks red from the wind and her eyes brighter than I'd seen in a long time. She didn't even bother to take off her coat before she walked into the living room and collapsed onto the sagging couch. "I saw something today," she said, her voice uncharacteristically lively. I looked up from the book I was pretending to read. "Yeah? What was it?" "It was beautiful," she murmured almost to herself. Her fingers twisted nervously together in her lap. A figurine, a porcelain statue of a dancer. She looked so graceful, so alive. I wasn't sure how to react. It wasn't like Mom to talk about things like that. She'd always found ornaments and decorations impractical, saying they were a waste of money. "It's silly," she added quickly, sensing my hesitation. I can't stop thinking about it. But it's too expensive and we don't need things like that." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Forget I said anything." I didn't forget. Her words stuck with me, and the next day, I found myself standing outside the small, cluttered store where she worked. It was the kind of place you'd walk past 100 times without noticing. Through the frosted window, I saw the figurine she had described, displayed on a wooden shelf, bathed in soft, yellow light. It was breathtaking. A simple sculpture, really, just a porcelain dancer frozen in mid-pirouette. Her arms lifted gracefully, her expression tranquil. I wasn't an expert on art, but something about that little figure made me stop and stare. It felt so delicate, as if the slightest wrong move might cause it to crumble. I stepped through the door, and the bell above chimed softly. The woman behind the counter glanced up, but didn't speak. I approached the shelf, each step of my boots creaking on the worn floorboards. The price tag hung beneath the figurine, and my heart sank. It wasn't cheap. I hesitated, thinking of the money I'd been setting aside for months to fix the roof. But then I remembered how Mom's eyes had lit up when she mentioned it that evening. The spark of joy I hadn't seen in so long. I found her in the kitchen when I got home, stirring a pot of soup. She looked up as I entered, her face softening as she saw me. "I've got something for you," I said, placing the brown paper bag carefully on the table. She furrowed her brow, drying her hands on the dish towel. "What is it?" "Just open it," I told her. She untied the string, her hands trembling a little as she pulled the figurine from the bag. She inhaled sharply, staring at it, her eyes wide in surprise, and for a long moment, I thought she wouldn't say anything. "You didn't?" she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "I did," I said, shrugging like it was no big deal, though my chest tightened in anticipation. I wasn't expecting her to react like this. She carefully set the figurine down, almost as if it were fragile, then turned to look at me. Her face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have." "Because you wanted it," I answered simply. "And you deserve something you want." She covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back the sobs, but one broke free anyway. She sank into a chair at the table, clutching the figurine like it was something sacred. I stood there, unsure of what to do. "I haven't been this happy in years," she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Seeing her so genuinely happy, like a weight had been lifted, made everything worth it. Every dollar spent, every sacrifice. I didn't care about the roof or the bills or anything else. I just wanted her to have something beautiful, something that made her smile. That night, the figurine found its place on the shelf above the fireplace, where the dancing light of the flames seemed to breathe life into it. Mom would glance at it every so often, a peaceful smile tugging at her lips, as though it reminded her of something good she'd once had, and now found again. But as I watched her smile, I couldn't shake the feeling that this happiness was fragile. just like the figurine itself, could break. And I wasn't sure either of us would be able to fix it if it did. Winter started to loosen its hold on the town, but the cold still seeped through the house in the mornings, creeping in through the cracks in the walls. Life had found a new rhythm. Mom worked late most nights, but when she came home, she had a kind of energy about her that hadn't been there before. She'd hum while she stirred soup, or spend her evenings arranging flowers in the living room, pausing now and then to glance at the figurine with a soft smile. As for me, my days were a jumble of routine and unease. It felt like I was waiting for something, but I couldn't pinpoint what. School had been out for months, and I'd been taking on odd jobs around town to help with the bills and repairs. But despite being busy, there was a hollow feeling that I couldn't shake, a quiet pressure that seemed to grow with each passing day. One morning, I woke up feeling worse than usual. My head was pounding, my throat raw, and my whole body ached like I had been run over by a truck. I'd been fighting off a cold for weeks, but this was something different. Mom saw me stagger into the kitchen, barely able to keep my eyes open. "You look awful," she said, placing a hand to my forehead. "You're burning up." "It's just a cold," I muttered, even though I knew she wouldn't believe me. I hated feeling weak, especially in front of her. "I'll be fine." "No, you're not," she said firmly, already pulling her phone out to call the pharmacy. "You've let this go on long enough. We're getting this fixed today." Later that afternoon, she returned with a small bag of medicine and a syringe. "This is what you need," she said, holding it up. "It's a vitamin shot. It'll help you recover faster." I stared at the syringe as if it were some kind of instrument of torture. "I'm not doing that." "It's not a big deal," she said, sitting down next to me on the couch. "I used to do this for your father when he was sick. You're stronger than you think." I shook my head, my palms sweaty just at the thought of it. "No way. Listen to me," she said, her voice softening. "The sooner you do this, the sooner you'll feel better. You trust me, don't you?" Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I hesitated. Then, reluctantly, I nodded. "Fine." She walked me through it, how to clean the spot, how to steady the syringe, how to push the plunger slowly. Her calmness made it seem almost easy. My hands were shaking as I followed her instructions, but somehow, I did it. When it was over, I couldn't believe how simple it had been. "You did great," she said, smiling with pride. "I knew you could do it." Her approval felt unexpectedly comforting, like I had passed some kind of unspoken test. And as much as I hated to admit it, I already felt better, if only because I had proven to myself that I could handle it. The following days passed in a blur of rest and recovery. But as my fever started to fade, I noticed something else bubbling beneath the surface. Mom started coming home later than usual, her coat faintly scented with a perfume that wasn't hers. I didn't ask any questions, but I could feel the distance between us widening. One evening, I was fixing a broken step on the porch when I heard her car pull into the driveway. She stepped out, laughing at something I couldn't hear, and for a split second, I thought she wasn't alone. But when I looked again, there was no one with her. Still, the way she lingered outside, adjusting her scarf and running her fingers through her hair, made me pause. When she finally came inside, her eyes avoided mine. "How's it going?" she asked, setting her bag down on the counter. "Better?" I muttered, unsure if she even heard me. She nodded absent-mindedly, then walked into the living room. I followed her, watching as she gently placed a single rose into a glass vase on the mantel, right next to the porcelain dancer. It was the first flower she'd brought home in weeks. "Where'd that come from?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the petals. "A friend gave it to me." "A friend from work?" I pressed. She hesitated again before answering, "It's nothing serious." Her answer didn't satisfy me, but I kept quiet. Instead, I observed her as she moved around the room, straightening things in that familiar, restless way, like she was trying to avoid something. There was a certain tension in the air, thick enough that neither of us dared to mention it. A few nights later, I woke up to faint voices drifting through the walls. They were muffled, but I could clearly hear her voice and someone else's. My heart raced as I quietly slipped out of bed, tiptoeing toward the living room. Through the slightly ajar door, I saw her standing by the fireplace, talking to a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, his beard neatly trimmed, exuding a calm confidence. He held a wine glass, using the other hand to gesture as he spoke. Mom laughed at something he said, but it wasn't her usual laugh. It sounded lighter, nervous even. I stepped back, retreating to my room before they could see me. Lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who was this guy? Why hadn't she mentioned him? The next morning, everything seemed normal again. But when I glanced at the mantel, I noticed the rose was gone. The air was biting that morning, the kind of cold that feels like it cuts straight through you. I was outside, hammering a loose board back into place, when Mom came out, pulling her cardigan tighter against the chill. She had that look again. The one she always got when she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Need help?" she asked, though we both knew it was more of a formality. "I've got it," I said, not looking up. My hands worked mechanically, pounding nails into the wood, while my thoughts swirled around everything I hadn't said. She lingered for a moment, hesitated, then stepped down to the driveway. "I'll be back late tonight," she said casually. "Don't wait up." I paused, the hammer still in my hand. "Where are you going?" She hesitated, just enough to make me suspicious. "Meeting some friends," she answered, her voice flat, as though it were rehearsed. The words felt distant and hollow, like they didn't belong. I nodded, but said nothing, watching her walk away, the gap between us widening with each step. That evening, the silence in the house was almost suffocating. I tried to distract myself with the usual chores, fixing the sink, sweeping the floor, but my thoughts kept circling back to her. By 9, I couldn't stand it anymore. Grabbing my jacket, I headed out into the cold night, not sure what I was hoping to find. The streets were nearly deserted, the faint hum of traffic the only thing breaking the silence. I wandered for what felt like hours, eventually finding myself in the center of town. The craft store where Mom worked was dark, the closed sign swaying in the wind. I turned onto a side street and stopped in front of a small cafe, its windows glowing warmly against the night. That's when I saw her, sitting at a table near the window, laughing softly at something the man across from her had said. It was him, the same man I'd seen in our living room. He leaned in close, his hand resting on the table between them. She didn't pull away. I stood frozen in place, not knowing what to do. A part of me wanted to barge in and demand answers, but another part, the larger part, felt stuck, paralyzed. It wasn't just anger I felt. It was something else, deeper. A mix of betrayal, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name, keeping me rooted to the sidewalk. When she came home that night, I was already sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. She looked surprised to see me, the sound of her keys clinking softly as she set them down. "You're still up," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "We need to talk," I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. She paused, then sat down across from me. "Okay, what's going on?" I stared at her for a long moment, trying to find the right words. "Who is he?" For a second, her face went blank, like she was considering denying it. But then she sighed, and I could see the weight of it on her shoulders. "You saw him?" I nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It's complicated," she said, her eyes avoiding mine. "I didn't know how to bring it up." "Try," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She took a deep breath, clasping her hands on the table. "His name is Mark. We met at the store. He's different. He makes me feel like I matter again, like I'm not just going through the motions." Her words hit me like a punch. I wanted to tell her that she mattered to me, that I was here for her, that she didn't need anyone else for validation. But the words wouldn't come. I couldn't say it. "I didn't want to hurt you," she continued, her voice soft but steady. "I just didn't want to make things more difficult." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You've done it." The silence that followed was deafening. She looked down at her hands, her face a mixture of guilt and frustration. "I didn't expect you to understand," she said quietly. "I don't," I admitted. "But I'm trying." The next few days were tense. We spoke only when we had to, each of us retreating into our own space. I buried myself in work, taking on every odd job I could find, just to avoid being home. She spent more time with Mark, coming home later each night, the house feeling emptier with every passing hour. But then, one night, everything came to a head. I was in the garage, going through a box of old tools, when I heard the sounds of raised voices. I stepped outside and saw Mom standing near Mark's car, their faces lit by the faint glow of the porch light. She was upset, waving her arms as she spoke. Mark stood there, calm, too calm, his arms crossed as he listened. I couldn't hear their words, but I didn't need to. The tension between them was thick enough to feel. After a few minutes, she spun around, stormed into the house, and slammed the door behind her. Mark lingered for a moment, then climbed into his car and drove off. I waited for a few minutes before heading back inside. Mom was in the kitchen, her head in her hands as she leaned against the counter. "Are you okay?" I asked gently, my voice quiet. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice thick. "Everything just feels so wrong." I wanted to reach out to comfort her, but I didn't know how. Instead, I stood there, awkward, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavily in the space between us. "I just need some time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to figure things out." I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what figuring things out really meant. As I turned to leave, she called after me. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer now, "for trying to understand." Her words lingered long after I went to bed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had more questions than answers. Spring crept in, slowly melting the frost that had settled over the house for months. The days grew longer, but the air inside still felt heavy. Mom and I moved around each other like cautious strangers, tiptoeing through the same space but never truly connecting. Our conversations were short, clipped, each word laden with things we weren't saying. Mark was still in the picture, but he appeared less and less. Their relationship seemed to falter after that night on the porch, though I couldn't tell if it was because of me or something else entirely. He still came by now and then, always polite, always distant. I tried to avoid him when I could, but when our paths did cross, he'd offer a brief, curt nod, his face unreadable. One morning, I woke to find Mom sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling something in a notebook, her brow furrowed with concentration. The sight of her so focused, so determined, caught me off guard. It reminded me of the way she used to look when she balanced the household budget back when Dad was still around. "Morning," I said, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Morning," she replied without looking up. "What's that?" I nodded toward the notebook. "Just plans," she said vaguely, tapping her pen against the table. "Things I've been thinking about." "Plans for what?" I pressed, genuinely curious. She hesitated, staring at the page before meeting my gaze. "For us," she said quietly. "For the house, for everything." I raised an eyebrow. "That's pretty broad." She sighed, finally meeting my eyes. "I've been thinking, maybe it's time for a change. This place, it holds too many memories. Some good, some bad. I don't know. Maybe it's time to start over." Her words hit harder than I expected. This house, as worn and imperfect as it was, had always been a constant. The thought of leaving it, of walking away from everything it represented, felt wrong, like losing another piece of the past. "You want to move?" I asked, unable to hide the surprise in my voice. "Maybe," she said, shrugging. "I don't know yet. It's just an idea." I didn't respond immediately. I wasn't sure how to. Instead, I finished my coffee and left for work, her words echoing in my head. A week later, I caught a cold. It wasn't anything serious, but it knocked me off my feet for a couple of days. Mom fussed over me more than usual, bringing me tea and soup, hovering like she didn't know what else to do. On the third day, she walked into my room holding a syringe. I froze. Immediately, I was on edge. "What's that for?" I asked, my voice tight. "It's a vitamin shot," she said calmly. "It'll help you recover faster." "I don't think so," I muttered, pulling the blanket higher. "I'm fine without it." "You're not fine," she replied, her tone firm. "And this will help. Trust me." I shook my head, refusing to budge, but she didn't give up. She sat on the edge of my bed, her voice softening. "It's not as bad as you think," she reassured me. "I've done it 100 times. It's nothing." I sighed, knowing she wouldn't let it go. "What if I mess it up?" "You won't," she smiled. "I'll show you how." With her guidance, I managed to give myself the injection, though my hands were trembling the whole time. When it was over, she clapped her hands together, beaming with pride. "See? I knew you could do it." Her pride in me felt oddly comforting, as though I had achieved something far more significant than it actually was. And, as much as I hated to admit it, I did feel a little better afterward. Things between us began to shift after that. The tension that had been building for weeks slowly started to ease, replaced by these small, tentative moments of connection. She started opening up more about her plans for the house, asking for my input on everything from the paint colors to furniture arrangements. It was as if we were finding a new way forward, slowly, but surely. I wasn't exactly sold on the idea of moving, but Mom's enthusiasm was contagious. I found myself getting swept up in the process, bit by bit. One afternoon, we set out to explore a few homes in town. We walked through a small, charming bungalow with a bright yellow door, and I saw something shift in her expression. Her eyes lit up in a way that felt almost like a spark of something long buried. She ran her hand over the kitchen counter, imagining the possibilities in her mind. "This could be it," she said softly, as if talking to herself. "Can't you just see us here?" I nodded, but my heart felt heavy. The thought of leaving the old house behind, with all its memories, made my chest tighten. But seeing her so full of hope and excitement made it hard to argue. Later that evening, as we flipped through photos of other houses, I asked the question that had been hanging over me for days. "What about Mark?" I asked, my voice uncertain. "Is he a part of these plans?" She paused, her smile faltering. The words seemed to get stuck in her throat. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice quieter. "We've been drifting. He's a good man, but I'm not sure he's what I need right now." The room fell silent, and I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't say anything at all. Instead, I leaned back, letting the stillness fill the space between us. It felt like the first moment of honesty between us in a long time. A few days later, she called Mark to meet her at a cafe. I didn't ask for details, but when she came home that night, there was something different about her. Her face was calm, almost peaceful, and there was a lightness to her that I hadn't seen in months. "It's over," she said simply, her voice firm but quiet. We both knew it was coming, but the weight of it still hung in the air. I nodded, unsure of what to say, but somehow, everything felt clearer after those words. She sat next to me on the couch, her eyes drifting to the porcelain figurine on the mantel. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes, letting go is the only way to move forward, even if it hurts." I wasn't sure if she meant Mark, the house, or something else entirely. But as I sat there beside her, I realized that for the first time in a long while, we were both beginning to understand what it meant to move on. The morning of the move arrived in a heavy, silent blur. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak, every shift in the air. Everything that had once filled the space now felt empty, like the house itself was holding its breath. The walls, stripped of photos and trinkets, felt colder, as if they were no longer part of us. Mom's boxes were stacked by the door, all of them carefully labeled in her neat handwriting. It was as though we were packing away not just our things, but pieces of ourselves. Each box held memories we couldn't carry with us, no matter how hard we tried. Mom stood by the window, hands clasped in front of her, staring out at the driveway like she was grounding herself before taking the final step. The porcelain figurine sat on the mantel, the last remaining symbol of what we'd known. She had insisted on carrying it herself. "Are you ready?" I asked, breaking the silence, my voice quieter than usual. She turned to me, her eyes soft, but her expression tinged with sadness. "Almost. Just one last look." I nodded and stepped back, giving her space. I could feel the weight of it, too. This house wasn't just a building. It was a chapter of our lives. Every inch of it was filled with us. The laughter, the tears, the countless moments that had shaped us. Letting it go felt like losing a part of ourselves. An hour later, we were loading the last box into the car when a gust of wind swept through the yard, scattering loose papers from an open bag. Mom rushed to grab them, her hair flying around her face. She caught one, but the rest blew out of reach, swirling down the street like stubborn memories that refused to be pinned down. I reached out to help, but she stopped me, shaking her head. "Let them go," she said quietly, the simplicity of her words cutting through the air. Let them go. It wasn't just the papers she was talking about. It was everything, everything we had held on to, everything we thought we couldn't leave behind. She was telling me it was time to move on. As we pulled out of the driveway, I looked back one last time. The house stood there, unchanged, as if it hadn't noticed we were leaving. I turned forward again, my hands gripping the wheel. The car was silent, the only sound the low hum of the engine. "Do you think we're making the right choice?" I asked, more to myself than to her. Mom didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost like she had already made peace with it. "The right choice isn't always the one that feels safest," she said. "Sometimes, it's the one that helps us grow." Her words hung in the air, and I let them settle in, unsure of how to respond. But when I glanced at her, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: hope. When we arrived at the new house, the first thing she did was place the porcelain figurine on the windowsill. The sunlight streamed through the glass, casting gentle shadows on the wall. She stepped back and smiled at it, like she had just completed the final piece of a puzzle. "Perfect," she said, the words soft but full of meaning. I looked at her, at the house, and then at the figurine glowing in the late afternoon light. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of everything we'd left behind. Instead, I felt the quiet promise of something new. That night, as we unpacked the last of the boxes, Mom handed me an envelope. "I found this while packing," she said. "It's for you." I opened it carefully. Inside was a picture of Dad holding me as a baby, his smile wide, his eyes full of life. On the back, in faded ink, he had written, "For my boy, never be afraid to start over." I stared at the words, my throat tightening. Mom sat beside me and placed her hand over mine. "I think he'd be proud of us," she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak. The figurine shimmered on the windowsill, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next.